Today we will learn New Historicism and the concept of New Historicism. So what is New Historicism? It is a form of literary theory whose goal is to understand intellectual history through literature. So it's not only the history of the people, but it's also the history of the intellectual class. It is the history how the scholars of the time see the history of their time. And it is literature through its cultural context. Because any literature that is written, it represents the time, it represents the culture, it represents the society. So when Premchand is writing, he talks about the rural Indian society. Or when Dickens is writing Tale of Two Cities, he is talking about London and Paris during the French Revolution. And in the same way, if black feminist authors are writing or black authors are writing, they are talking about their rights. So rights, history, movements, everything that is happening sociologically, culturally, historically at the time gets its representation in literature of that time, which follows the 1950s field of history of ideas and refers to itself as a form of cultural poetics. It was first developed in the 1980s primarily through the work of the critic and University of California, Berkeley English professor Stephen Greenblatt. Greenblatt's criticism is very important because he sees the works of Shakespeare in the light of New Historicism, and he gained a widespread influence in the 1990s. The term New Historicism was coined by Greenblatt when he collected a bunch of essays, and then out of a kind of desperation to get the introduction done, he wrote that the essays represented something called a New Historicism. But what we see in this concept of New Historicism is that all the works that he was seeing or he was trying to put together, there was something common. And what was common was the historical, sociological background that each work was referring to. So Harold Allen Wieser points out these things about New Historicism, that every expressive act is embedded in a network of material practices. There is something happening on the surface, and that is represented in art and literature. That every act of unmasking, critique and opposition uses the tools it condemns and risks falling prey to the practice it exposes. That literary and non-literary texts circulate inseparably. So in what you see represented in non-literary texts, similar ideas will be represented in the non-literary texts. So if you see that if there is freedom fight in India, so the literary texts are also talking about the freedom movement, the national movement, and the non-literary texts are also talking about the same thing. That no discourse, imaginative or archival, gives access to unchanging truth. So the truths will get represented in various forms. It will be noted not only in history but also in fiction. Nor expresses inalterable human nature. So the human nature remains the same. Even in a work of fiction, happiness, sadness, all the representations are true to life. That a critical method and a language adequate to describe culture under capitalism participate in the economy they describe. And that's why in the new times, in the postmodern times, capitalism is taking over culture, advertisements are taking over culture. So they are using the emotions as a tools to sell the products. I would simplify it in this way. So subliterary texts and uninspired non-literary texts all came to be read as documents of historical discourse. So what was not thought earlier to be historical, they were reread in the historical perspective, side by side with the great works of literature. A typical focus on new historicist critics led by Stephen Orgel has been an understanding Shakespeare less as an autonomous great author in the modern sense than as a means of reconstructing the cultural milieu of Renaissance theatre, a collaborative and largely anonymous free for all and the complex social politics of the time in this sense. Shakespeare's plays are seen as inseparable from the context in which he wrote. To understand it more, you have to see what is contextualism and what is thick description. He was not talking out of context. Even when Shakespeare was writing historical plays like Henry IV, he was also critiquing the divine right of the king, and he was also critiquing the politics of his own time. So it's very important. The impact of the present time, of the present historical context, was always there in the mind of Shakespeare. Influential historians behind the eruption of the New Historicism are Lynn Hunt and Michel Foucault, as they both taught at UC Berkeley during its rise as postmodern approach to history. So New Historicism can be seen as a postmodern approach to history. So I think now that your concept of New Historicism would be clear. Thank you.